is to engage in the discussion. And so while we have panelists here, we're also going to allow time for you to interact with the panelists, and we want you to bring to bear what you believe about whether or not there is an American character. Before we get started, I should say there are a couple people in the room that I do want to acknowledge, one being John Beck, hanging out by the door. John is our facilitator extraordinaire. He has the auspicious duty of pulling together these forums where we try to have wide-ranging topics that we can bring faculty together from across campus and bring different perspectives to bear on the topic. And we have Joyce Samuel here in front, who staffs the forums from the Honors College. And I am Cynthia Jackson-Elmore, the Dean of the Honors College, serving as the moderator tonight. And I am pleased because I believe this is one of the forums with the most co-sponsors we've had to date. And I do want to acknowledge our co-sponsors. We have the College of Arts and Letters, Lyman Briggs College, James Madison College, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, the College of Social Science, the Department of English, Department of History, Department of Political Science, Department of Sociology, Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures, and finally Chicano and Latino Studies. All of these colleges and departments and centers came together to say that this forum is not only of value, but something that we want to make sure that we broadly get out into the campus environment. And so we hope that you know that this is the beginning of the discussion, not the end, and we hope that we spark you to continue having discussions. And I also would like to thank our panelists for this evening. Looking forward to the discussions and what they bring to bear. And I will introduce each one of them just prior to them opening comments. After we have opening comments from each panelist, we'll allow a little bit of cross-discussion with the panelists, and then we will open it to the floor for you to pose questions or offer your insights. And so first this evening, we're going to hear from Dr. Peter Knupfer from the Department of History. He is an associate professor there, and his scholarly research has focused on sectional crisis and American political culture and behavior during the Civil War era. His book, The Union as It Is, Constitutional Unionism and Sectional Compromise, 1787 to 1861, examined the civic tradition of grand compromises over morality and economically intractable issues in the early republic. And one might say that those same issues are in front of us today. He is the executive director of HNET and an associate director of Matrix, MSU's Digital Humanities Center, and it is the largest online scholarly community in the social sciences and humanities. And he's going to pose tonight that there is indeed an American character and is based in rights. Dr. Knupfer?
Well, thank you very much. Is the microphone too loud or feeding back or causing problems here? Okay. Well, I'm glad to have the opportunity to come here and talk about this. Interestingly enough, it's a subject that historians don't like to talk about, and for them, in fact, has become passé. For many historians, the whole question of whether an American character exists is an old question, one that they do not ask anymore, one that they have bypassed in their scholarship, having moved on to other things. It's very interesting to see this trend. And so I'm kind of glad, in fact, that the question has come up here. Modern historians, as a general rule, are indifferent to the question of American identity. They figure that the country already spent too much time trying to figure that out, and in the past few years have moved on to other concerns. They become much more interested in issues that transcend national boundaries. They're less interested in an American identity than they are in gender and in class and in race. It's of less concern to them that one is identified as an American, that one might be an American woman or an African American or something like that. That is the result of the fragmentation of our discipline and of the rise of new concerns in the past 20 or 30 years. But you know, it runs completely contrary to the very history of the country, because one of the things that defines Americans is their obsession with who they are and where they came from and why they are what they are. And so this thinking is a sea change from a good 40 years ago. When the question first came to me, when John Beck contacted me and we started thinking about this, it took me back to Daniel Borston's remarkable book written 40 years ago, his trilogy, The Americans, which is the quintessential book describing an American culture, an American character, where it came from, what it stood for. It was considered a masterpiece when it came out in the 1960s. But that was the culmination of centuries of navel-gazing by Americans about who they are and where they're from. This extends back to William Bradford and to the crew on the Mayflower, the Patriots of '76, the Jacksonian adherents of Manifest Destiny, Lincoln's evocation of an idea as the primary element of American nationality, Frederick Jackson Turner's assertion that it was interaction with the frontier, with the environment that created rugged individualism and democracy, and that created a quintessential American character. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points for a nation that he claimed was too proud to fight, arguing that an ideology and an idea is what defines Americans for what they are. FDR's 4 freedoms, which he announced during World War II. And of course, for later generations, King's evocation of a dream on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. All of this suggests, to me at least, that historians, as usual, are off the mark, and that in fact the question of who we are and what an American character is in fact one of the defining characteristics of living in this country. So in the spirit of the hour, I'm going to take a stab at it. I'm going to offer just a few propositions and do my best to keep to my time limit on this. And maybe that'll generate some conversation in addition to what my colleagues have to offer. I would summarize my feelings about this as what I would call the Mayflower Compact Syndrome. That is, if there's one thing that I think defines an American character, if you could call it that, it is a stubborn resistance to established authority that in turn requires the establishment of authority by common consent. It is Americans' constant rubbing against being governed and their desire to govern others in return that has a lot to do with what defines Americans as who they are. Well, what would be the elements of this characteristic Knupfer would suggest? I'll suggest just a couple of propositions. And I'll try to avoid the scholarly afflatus of weird jargon and so forth and just cut to the chase. One element of it is the simple proposition that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The intuition, whether one wants to call it an ideology or not, that people who possess power commonly abuse it, which I believe is built into, you could say it's hardwired into the American character, but we can debate that proposition. Whether that power is corporate, whether it's political, whether it's military, the farther away it is located from the objects of its governance, the more dangerous and suspicious it becomes. I believe that that is very much a part of the way Americans view themselves and those around them. To me, another element of this might be summarized as taking matters into my own hands, a kind of populism, a populist instinct, the belief, but also the instinct, as I'm arguing, that the wisdom and the folly of a civilization reside in its common folk, expressed, I think, through the sovereignty of markets and majorities. And thus, I think, Americans as a people have a passion for participation through what I would call the 4 V's. I'm getting into the kind of weird listing tonight. Voluntarism, voting, violence, and vigilantism, which I think all have a part of the way Americans believe they should deal with each other and those around them. I think that that is a part of the American character. I think another element of the American character is the simple belief that you are no better than I am. A belief that indeed extended out of the American Revolution, as Gordon Wood argued years ago, that one of the things that made the American Revolution a radical event was the fact that even though inherited wealth still existed, and even though privilege still existed, even though all the elements of class still existed, I did not have to tip my hat to you on the street. That in fact, you are no better than I am. This sense of very simple and commonsensical egalitarianism, I think, is a part of the American character. I think another part of the American character is what I would call get it in writing, and get it in writing now. To me, it's hardly surprising that a country founded on the notion of a social contract is obsessed with writing it down. From the colonial charters to a written Declaration of Independence and a written Constitution, to articles of incorporation for the modern corporation, to making contracts sovereign through the Constitution, to the resort to vaporous treaties as a cover for removing Indians from their lands, only to have Indians return and use those very treaties to seek contribution and retribution, to the triumph of written statute law over common law. Americans, I believe, have been literalists, and I can't forget the image of the late senator from West Virginia, himself a former Klansman, a Robert Byrd, constantly carrying a copy of the Constitution in his pocket and waving it in debate, arguing it's written down here. This is where it's written down. To me, that is all part and parcel of the way Americans view themselves. I think Americans wrap all of this up in a very, very neat package of rights talk and entitlements. Rights talk, I would argue, is born of the conflict of rights. And the way Americans speak of rights and the way they talk of fairness and the way they speak of their relationships to each other, all of this suggests an almost obsession with the notion of rights and of Americans as having rights, however one wishes to define them. I discover this every day in my office as students come to discuss with me their rights. I think that it's all a part of what Americans claim to be. All of these attributes, I suggest, get it in writing, power corrupts, taking matters in my own hands, populism, egalitarianism, all of these, I would argue, create a boundless energy of inventiveness, of acquisitiveness, of selfishness, of expansionism, and I guess you could call it creative destruction, as institutions are remade, rewritten, destroyed, reconfigured by sovereign consumers, producers, and citizens. Sometimes this is accomplished through violence, even mass violence. Sometimes it's accomplished through peace, peaceful means. Sometimes through great crises. Sometimes in the multitudes of tiny decisions made in garage workshops and in polling booths. And indeed, what is the great news today? That Facebook just bought Instagram for $1 billion. Instagram, which was the brainchild of a couple of guys thinking, wouldn't it be great if you could share photographs from your iPhone? They now are multimillionaires, and their company is worth $1 billion. An American character exists, I would argue, because Americans ignore people like us. They ignore the scholars, and they keep asking themselves, who are we? Where did we come from? An American character exists because people who are not Americans keep telling us it does. They tell us that they recognize an American when they encounter one on the street, something that I ran into in a year in South Africa. Day after day, people knew who the Americans were and who they weren't, or who they claimed were Americans. And they keep trying to come here and become one. which suggests to me that there is an American character, and that, in fact, Americans have in many ways condemned themselves to constantly redefining it.
Thank you very much, Peter. So the claim on the floor is there is an American character. Now we're going to hear from Stephanie Nawyn, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, and her research and teaching interests and expertise are in gender and immigration, with a focus on forced migration, families, and social incorporation. She conducts research on community development among immigrants and looks at the importance of social networks and social capital to immigrant and refugee incorporation, as well as the socioeconomic advancement of African-born immigrants in the United States. She's also recently published work integrating gender and feminist theory with migration studies. And tonight she is going to be speaking with us about market citizenship and occupying personhood.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I feel like I'm okay. So where Peter left off is a good place for me to come in his reference to people coming to the U.S. trying to become American. So as a migration scholar, when I think about what does it mean to be American, what if we have an American character, I mean, I would agree that there is an American character, considering the fact that, the term American, assuming we're talking about people living in the United States, and I think Sheila's going to talk about that, so I don't want to steal your thunder. But so as a migration scholar, when I'm thinking about what is an American character, I think of what it takes for people coming from other countries to come here and become, quote unquote, American, and what sort of processes they go through to do that. Now, a lot of other countries, they have, especially, countries that are immigrant receiving, developed countries, they have integration policies. Canada, for example, their federal government actually pays for immigrants to take language classes, English in most of the country, French if you are in Quebec. They have policies to help immigrants integrate in lots of different ways. The U.S. doesn't really have an integration policy per se with voluntary immigrants. We only do this kind of intentional integration, and I say intentional because there's lots of ways in which different institutions and legal processes shape immigrants' assimilation experiences. But in terms of an intentional policy, we do this only with refugees. So, I look at the resettlement program that we have in this country and figure out, okay, well, what does it want refugees to do? What is the end goal for refugees who go through this resettlement? That tells me what our federal government wants people to do to become American. And there's lots of kind of different elements to it, but it all has essentially one goal. What do you think that goal is? We'll do a little early Q&A. So what is it that refugees are supposed to do above and beyond anything else when they come in this country? Our government wants them to do what? Yes?
Pay taxes.
Pay taxes. And what do you have to do in order to pay taxes?
Work.
You have to work for a living. You have to have a job. And so our language classes are vocationally based. In the state of Michigan, all the states have kind of different policies. But so in Michigan, our state government doesn't give local communities any money for language classes that aren't vocationally based. So if you want to do something to help refugees know how to navigate the bus system in English, go to the grocery store, talk to their kid's teacher, you have to make some, cockamamie argument that this is vocationally based. Otherwise, there'll be no state support for it. The very first thing you do when you come here is you get a Social Security number, you apply for that, because without a Social Security number, you don't get a job. And refugees are only given financial support for ranges, depending on the state, 90 days to six months. And certainly after that 6 months, you're off the support. You're off the doles, so to speak, and you're expected to be economically self-sufficient. Now, when I talk about this to an American audience, I get a lot of shrugs. Yeah, so what? Isn't, you know, come here, you should work. Everybody works. In an audience with Canadians, Europeans, very different response. Because in those countries, refugees, they think of integration, becoming Belgian, becoming Dutch, becoming Swedish, becoming British. It's a very different process, much more multifaceted, much more culturally based. You're expected to have cultural competency. You're expected to act like one of us. In America, we don't really care if you act like one of us as long as you're paying your own way. And so everything kind of in the U.S. boils down to, you know, being able to have a job, being economically self-sufficient, and certainly not being dependent upon public assistance. And what I have seen happen, not just in the resettlement program, but across sort of all sectors of American life, is this eliminating of any sort of public good and focusing everything on private good. So that everybody should have a job, everybody should be self-sufficient, and increasingly, when we talk about rights, those rights are increasingly tied to your success in the market. So if you have a good job, you can, some wealth, what do you need public school for? You can send your kids to a private school. If you get really wealthy, maybe you don't even need a police force. You have your own private security. And so as you know, this increasing privatization of rights happens, you see funding for public schools getting cut, funding for police force being cut, funding for all of these public goods being cut. And what happens? Well, if you're successful in the marketplace, you don't need these public goods. You can just pay for them, right? And when refugees come here, and some of them, keep in mind, feel that they've actually become refugees because of their involvement with the U.S. government, because they've assisted the U.S. government. So you get Hmong refugees who fought and did bombing raids in Cambodia during the Vietnam War. You get Iraqi refugees who collaborated with the U.S.-led Provisional Authority. They worked as interpreters, they provided information, and now their families are being threatened. Their family members are killed, they're being threatened, and they have to come to the U.S. basically because of their assisting the U.S. government. These folks come to the U.S. and are told basically you don't count, you're not really welcome here unless you can contribute to the market, unless you can be a successful market citizen. And you know, political sociologists call this market citizenship. This idea that increasingly Americans are losing the rights to things like public education, are losing the rights to things like good roads. Anybody who drives a car in Michigan knows what this is like. I've actually had conversations with my son, who's 6 years old. We started having, Mommy, why are the roads so bad? And, as we're driving over numerous potholes, I'm like, well, we've run out of money, and apparently no one's going to, you know, there's no public investment in things like infrastructure like roads anymore. All of these things, parks, you know, and healthcare. We're having a huge debate now about whether or not healthcare should be or can be a public good. And so refugees come here and they think that, you know, this is a really wealthy country. Yes, they're going to have to work hard, but you know, they're going to be able to establish themselves. They're going to have a safe place to live. And what refugees tell me is, you know, when I left, the war was out here. And then I come to the U.S., and now the war is in my head. And they talk about this sense of loss of their personhood. That because I come here and I'm poor, because I'm not very successful in the marketplace, and most of these folks get jobs. very, very quickly. I mean, it's stunning, having no English skills. I work with Burundian refugees, some of whom have never been to school, never have a pencil before they got to the U.S., and they're getting jobs, but they're bad jobs. They don't pay well. They have no idea how to get a better one, and they're just kind of thrown into the system. And they say that, you know, when I go talk to even my resettlement counselor, or I go talk to somebody at the Secretary of State's office to try to get a driver's license, or I, you know, go talk to, you know, all of these institutional representatives, I'm judged as not a complete person, not a real human being, because I'm not successful in the market. I'm not one of these people who can pay for these private goods anymore. And they talk about it as a loss of personhood. And then while I was watching the Occupy movement unfold, I saw something really similar, that people were protesting, not that they felt like they should, you know, that everyone should be rich, that I should have as much money as somebody else, but that those other people are no better than me. That those rich people are not better people than me. They're not more human than me. And yet, they have rights that I don't have. They can send their kids to good schools. They can go to the hospital or see a doctor whenever they're sick, and I can't do that. They can buy these things. It used to be public goods. It used to be rights, social rights, maybe not legal rights, but social rights in this country. And I can't do that anymore. That maybe my parents had this, and I don't have it anymore. And so thinking about the arc of what it means to be American has evolved, I've been very distressed by how this evolution of rights has gone from, you know, codified rights and not just codified rights, but taken for granted rights of public good, to disintegration of that, the disintegration of these public things that we could all share, and a de-evolution into, you know, you get the rights you can afford to purchase. So I don't know where that takes us. It's a little depressing, but that's where I see it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So we have still on the table that there is an American character. It's tied to rights, and it's tied to whether or not you can buy the rights you want. So that's where the argument is going thus far. We're going to turn to Associate Professor Jeff Wray from Film Studies, Creative Writing in the Department of English. He specializes in film production, screenwriting, and film studies, and has a variety of publications, director and writer of The Evolution of Bert, a film, China, an independent television services project from PBS, The Slave Ship of Injustice, another film, and August, a film. He's taught courses in screenwriting, the studies in ethnic film, advanced screenwriting, a seminar in English, and the creative process, as well as literature in English, modern media, and culture. And tonight he's going to discuss the American character, desired, contested, and detested, and look at American black male identity via film with a case study of Sidney Poitier persona in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner.
Thank you. This is going to be flashback moment here, y'all. So we're going to be into the late 60s and into the 70s. So other than probably about 6 people in this room, I think I'm going to have to do a lot of explaining here.
Oh, the count's higher than 6.
Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is show you a clip from the film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And then we'll come back to this clip in a moment.
Hi, Kelly, how are you?
Oh, hell's done broke loose now.
What's wrong? That waste disposal
No,
don't
it ain't that, but you just remember I said all hell's done
Well, what's
broke loose.
happened? Where's Christina? I see
She's
her
out
car
in the
there.
terrace with little Joey.
With
and
Joey?
somebody calls herself Dr. Prentice.
Doctor? There's a doc... Oh, what's wrong? What's happened? Joey?
Here he comes. Daddy,
What?
how are you?
What's happened? What are you doing here? Tilly said there was a doctor here.
There is. Dr. John Wade Prentice. This is my dad.
Pleased to meet you.
How are you? Nice to know you. But what is it? Is something
Oh,
wrong?
of course, there's nothing wrong. I just decided to come home early. Dr. Prentice and I met in Hawaii, and we flew back in the same plane this morning.
Oh, well. Sit down. I thought something was really wrong. Tilly said
Oh,
that...
Tilly's behaving very strangely today. Would you like a cup of coffee?
No, thanks. I have a date to play golf with Monsignor Ryan. How are you? What's the matter? You having a chill?
No, darling, I'm fine.
Doctor, were you practicing in San Francisco? Sit down.
No, sir. I'm just here for one day.
Oh, where is your practice? Hawaii?
Well, no, I'm not established in any one place. I'm in tropical medicines, mostly in Africa these past few years.
Oh, well, that sounds interesting.
Everything about Dr. Prentice is interesting.
I'm sure it is. Well, I wish I had more time, but you excuse me.
Couldn't you be off an hour late and stay and talk with us?
I loved it, Joey, but I mustn't keep the Monsignor waiting. No, I'm going to be later, so this. Will I be seeing you later, Doctor?
You certainly will.
Good. Well, that's good.
Dr. Prentice will be here for dinner, Matt.
Oh, fine. Then you can tell me all about
And
the
there's a
African...
great deal to tell, too, isn't there, Mom?
Well, fine. See you all later. What the hell is going on here?
This doesn't make sense either.
Well, I told you, didn't I?
What did you tell him? Look, Chris, if you don't explain to me in the next few minutes what you three are playing at...
I can explain it, Mr. Drake.
You can? Well, let's have it.
Well, it's my fault. You see, we have a sort of a situation here. Joanna and I didn't just meet in Hawaii. We spent a good deal of time together. I mean, all the time after we met. And, well, we have this problem. I fell in love with your daughter. And as incredible as it may seem, she fell in love with me. And we flew back to San Francisco to see if you or Mrs. Strayton would have any objections if we got married. Joanna told her mother as soon as she walked in, and I had the stupid idea that maybe there was some way to break this gently.
Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was perhaps one of the last great Hollywood films in this very kind of white liberal tradition. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. But before I get to the late 60s, I'm moving back to the late 70s here. On the night of July 21st, 1978, Richard Pryor and Dorothy Fulltime were on the Johnny Carson show. Dorothy Fulltime was a famous local newspaper woman and commentator in the Cleveland area when I was growing up. She was one of the few women in the news business and quite outspoken. She had a local reputation, but she also had somewhat of a national profile. Some of it due to her being, at that time, still the rare woman in the news business, and some of it due to her longevity in the news business. By the time of that 1978 Johnny Carson show, Dorothy Fulltime was in her 80s and still an active contributor to the Cleveland news scene. And if you do not know Richard Pryor, I feel sorry for you. Your assignment, if you do not know him, is to go out and to get 2 of his classic comedy albums, That Nigga's Crazy from 1974, and his patriotically titled follow-up, The Bicentennial Nigga, of course, from 1976. By this time, Richard Pryor was making the move from raw and blue used to be the word for dirty comic, stand-up comic, to full-fledged Hollywood star, one of the few major black stars. Anyway, the Richard Pryor pairing with Dorothy Fulltime that night on the Carson show turned out to be one of the oddest pairings in the history of American television. Pryor, the star, was first. He did his bit on sex and pimps and his pet monkey getting high and wanting sex, and of course on race, particularly how funny and odd the white man was. The octogenarian grand dame, Dorothy Fulltime, came out next. With Richard Pryor sitting to her right smoking a cigarette, Miss Fulltime launched into a sweet romantic rendition of her life in America during the 1920s. She beamed as she told Johnny Carson, sitting to her left, about the balls, the nightlife, the dancing, and oh, what a great time it was to be alive in America at that time period. At some point, as she continued to wax poetic about this great time in her life and this great period in broad American life, Richard Pryor quietly whispered his retort to her version of that America and of that time. And niggas was getting lynched. And as Dorothy Fulltime continued, Richard Pryor softly inserted 2 or 3 more times, and niggas getting lynched. At which point, a frustrated Miss Fulltime turned to Pryor and snapped, "Why do you keep saying that? This is my story." As Johnny Carson laughed at the great unexpected television he had created, Richard Pryor politely and graciously deferred to Miss Fulltime. "Yes, ma'am, that is indeed your story." Is there an American character? Well, it depends on who is being asked. It depends on whose story it is. It depends on who is constructing and doing the telling. It depends on whose story is privileged. It depends on who is listening, who is the audience. It depends on who is included. Art can sometimes expose racial, social, political, legal, and historical tensions inherent in any thought of an American character. I make films and I teach films. The first real American cinematic event, Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's 1915 racist opus, swayed audiences to a lost cause ideology in which black folks were the antithesis of a genuine and pure American character. The Birth of a Nation narrative urged Southern whites and Northern whites to unify in order to first save the white female, secondly, to save the true Union, and thirdly, to preserve the divinely inspired American character that was under duress and attack from renegade, brutal, oversexed, free blacks, and mulattoes. The supertext of Birth of a Nation, which is really a brilliant film, a brilliant visual and narrative piece of cinema, was a plea for white unity and an exclusively white American character and an argument against black Americanness and a serious questioning of black humanity. There's a whole lot of films I would love to throw in there in between, but I would just reference something like To Kill a Mockingbird from 1962, from the 1960 Harper Lee novel. That pushes this kind of new revised, at least representation of an American character as an enlightened white man. Atticus Finch and Gregory Peck become this kind of merge between character and real person. Not necessarily a more inclusive ideal or representation of the American character, but one that is more racially fair and just, but still embodied in an authoritative white male patriarchy. Now I'm getting to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. I offer all that prologue to get to the black male representation in the mid to late 60s in American film, and I think that that's a pretty fascinating time for that representation. For those of us of a certain age, such a discussion has to include the actor Sidney Poitier and the film that you saw, the clip that you saw, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, from 1967. This film, Poitier's role in it, and the reception of the film have much to say about the perception of and desirability of an expansive and inclusive concept of the American character at a critical moment. The Poitier character that you saw there in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Dr. John Wade Prentice, I love that strongly Protestant name, I just love it, is a variation of the persona that Poitier had played since his first film role as a doctor attempting to treat a white racist patient in the film No Way Out from 1950. So from really that post-war period up through 1967, the Poitier persona is created kind of film after film. And there is no other kind of persona there. It is the Poitier persona. If you can't get Poitier for your film, you don't make the film. If you can't get that particular black guy, you don't make the film. If you can't get that star, you don't make the film. The Poitier screen persona from that time forward, from No Way Out forward, was of the smart, conscientious, strong, but not too strong, representative American Negro, making his way and moving forward into the mainstream of American life. This persona was mostly in line with the ideology and aspirations of the civil rights movement. So you had this kind of twinning going on between the movement and in the persona of Portier. And Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, at which time Portier was at the pinnacle of his popularity, 1967. He has the 3 highest grossing Hollywood films in 1967, all in the same year. And Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the narrative stakes are even higher. On the heels of nearly 2 decades of civil rights movement actions, victories, and firsts, the Portier character does not just tiptoe into the mainstream in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but wants to marry into the mainstream, read White America. And this is what is interesting. The Portier character, Dr. John Wade Prentice, is a Hollywood, popular culture, mainstream civil rights, white liberal attempt to construct an ideal embodiment of the American character who is Negro and acceptable. And those are some new things there. American character, Negro, and acceptable. Not marginal, right in the middle there. And marrying into this idealized family. And the construction of the character, the construction of the John Wade Prentice character is pretty interesting as well. This character is handsome, articulate, upwardly mobile, comfortable in a variety of social settings, gracious, accommodating, asexual. His fiance wants to have sex in Hawaii. He says no because no, baby, I can't do that. He is a doctor working in tropical medicine, serving in parts of Africa and at ease in a Swiss chalet. The narrative purpose of this kind of, what is the narrative purpose of this kind of groundbreaking black male character? Well, in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the question is he good and acceptable enough for our white daughter? In terms of the greater terms of the times, the question from then and of course perhaps now is at what cost? Now this is a construction of the fiance, of the male. He is all of those things. If I came across a person like that, Sidney Poitier, I would probably marry him. So you got to understand this construction is really, really stacked. Hollywood is typically conservative, and of course, even though this is a comedy, they're very nervous about dealing with an interracial theme, but they can't resist themselves. Okay, so what, in greater terms of the times, the question from then and perhaps now, at what cost? What construction and reconstruction of the American Negro, of black women, of Latinos, of Latinas, is necessary in order to become viable in the discussion of an American character? So part of that has to do with this desire, mostly kind of civil rights ideology, this desire to be included, to be a part of this American character, to preach and push yourself as the same, with the same aspirations of those that you have. This 1967 Hollywood popular culture experiment in the construction of an inclusive rendering of the American character was met with 2 distinct responses. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was the most popular film of the year, and it has really become this kind of cultural touchstone in terms of, I mean, some people say, use that term, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and they have no idea of the root of that. And there's a great Black Uhuru song, too, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, as well. 2 minutes. Oh, man. Okay. So it was the most popular film of the year, a great Hollywood success. It made lots of money. But this 67-68 period was a critical moment of tension between the old guard black civil rights movement with their white liberal partners and the rising voices of the black arts movement, black nationalist cultural and political sentiment. And some of the responses from that end are these. Cultural critic and dramatist Clifford Mason in his 1967 New York Times critical essay, and the title tells it all. Why does white America love Sidney Poitier so? I'll just go with that title there. Black nationalist and cultural critic Larry Neal in his New York Times review, Beware of the Tar Baby. Blacks have gotten themselves immersed in the tar baby of dominant cinema ideology, locked into a prison of distorted symbols and images that the very attempt to extricate ourselves from only leads to more confusion. James Baldwin, And James Baldwin, if you know, of course, if you haven't read any Baldwin, when you go get the Richard Pryor things, next, go get some Baldwin. He has a somewhat broader essay in the 1968 Look magazine. The isolation that menaces all American artists is multiplied 1,000 times and becomes absolutely crucial and dangerous for all black artists. Sidney Poitier's roles and identity as an artist must be considered within the context of race relations, racial injustice, and the entertainment industry's ideology of racial subordination. Condemn Poitier not for the roles that he has been forced to play, but the country's and industry's racism for so relentlessly prefiguring them. And Baldwin ends that essay with looking at kind of the current social and historical moment. White Americans appear to be under the compulsion to dream, whereas black Americans are under the compulsion to awaken. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is one film at one moment in time. Sidney Poitier is a trailblazing and now iconic American actor. His films and screen persona were at the crux of a contested representation of Americanness, blackness, black male identity, and I would posit, especially in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, an attempt at a more inclusive, broader, but very flawed popular culture revision of the representation of an American character. Some 45 years later, the idea of an American character is still a great desire in many quarters. There is a desire to define ourselves as being part of something perhaps greater than ourselves, but the battles and movements to make America more inclusive, freer, and of greater recognition of all of our parts in history also create a more contested sum of those parts. An American character is one that is constantly under construction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on the table is still that there is an American character, but by whose definition and whose story, and that it's often through social construction that we come to understand the American character. And we have the tension between, is it rights and is it economics? So is it a class issue, or is it tied to racial ethnic identity that determines the nature of the American character? And next we will have Dr. Sheila Contreras, who is an associate professor in the Department of English and director of Chicano and Latino Studies. Her research and teaching interests include Chicano, Latin literature, multi-ethnic literatures, the literatures and theories of travel and tourism, American Studies and Women's Studies. She teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses in American Studies, Chicano and Latino Studies, and Women's Studies. And her courses include Introduction to Chicano Latino Literature, Let's Go Mexico, Travel, Tourism, and Revolution in the Early 20th Century, and Nationalism and Feminism in the United States. And currently she directs the Chicano Latino Studies program, which includes both a PhD program and an undergraduate specialization. And tonight she will talk about the concept of Nuestro America, the socio-political implications of claiming Americanness solely as a U.S. identity, and what that suggests about an American character.
Hi, thank you very much. So I have an image up there that y'all should be able to see. I couldn't get it any bigger. I guess one of the things I'm wondering is if you notice anything about it. What do you notice about it? Mexico's as big as North America. Other observations? Anything missing, maybe? Sorry? There's no U.S. Yes, the U.S. is missing. Now, the first time I saw this was in, I think it was 1994, and some friends had just come from Mexico. And the artist, Greg Corneau, is a Canadian artist from London, Ontario. He died in, I think it was about 93 or so. They had flyers of this image, and they were just pasting them up everywhere they went. This was also the time when the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect, January 1st, 1994, also the beginning of the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, all of which was linked to the North American Free Trade Agreement. So I like this, you know, and it's an interesting comment you made about, sir, about Mexico being as big as North America, because Mexico, people in Mexico consider themselves to be part of North America. And Mexico is is still North America. So those, I guess what I wanted to, for us to think about is precisely the idea of claiming the identity of American and what it means. Now, initial impressions of the Americas are based in, sort of emerge out of explorer accounts, missionary accounts, a lot of early, what would later become ethnography or anthropological accounts of Native people in the Americas. And out of that, you know, developed a concept, and I had an image I was going to show you of the noble savage, for example. You know, the idea of a romantic, primitive, you know, people, culture, civilizations more connected to spirituality, more connected to the land, more open and accepting in terms of you know, alternative child-rearing practices, in terms of sexuality, just sort of freer, more connected to the body, to land, to spirituality, these sorts of things. This was an early, I would say, an early sort of beginning of this idea of the American character. So I wanted to just call your attention to this passage from José Martí's Nuestra América. José Martí was Cuban, and he wrote this in 1892. And so I just want to read it real quickly. But our America may also face another danger, which comes not from within, but from the differing origins, methods, and interests of the containment's two factions. The hour is near when she will be approached by an enterprising and forceful nation that will demand intimate relations with her, though it does not know her and disdains her. Therefore, the urgent duty of our America is to show herself as she is in one soul and intent, rapidly overcoming the crushing weight of her past, and stained only by the fertile bloodshed, by hands that do battle against ruins and by veins that were punctured by our former masters. The disdain of the formidable neighbor who does not know her is our America's greatest danger. And it is urgent, for the day of the visit is near, that her neighbor come to know her, and quickly, so that he will not disdain her. Out of ignorance he may perhaps begin to covet her, but when he knows her, he will remove his hands from her in respect. One must have faith in the best in man and distrust the worst. One must give the best every opportunity so that the worst will be laid bare and overcome. If not, the worst will prevail. So what Martí is asserting is an American character that is really very different than, I believe, what we think of when we think of Americanness, because his Nuestra América is Latin America, and the sort of sort of predatory presence to the north is, of course, the U.S. It's typical when you go to Latin America, or you know, to Mexico, which is part of Latin America, for people really to sort of challenge the idea of the U.S. as sort of representing America. I learned a long time ago not to. I don't call myself American. You know, my kids, I raise them. You know, I've raised them to call themselves citizens of the United States. Although when you're in Mexico and you say that, they'll say which United States, because it's also the United States of Mexico. But I'm trying. And also, I guess I should say too, I grew up outside of the U.S. a lot because my father was enlisted in the military. I grew up on Air Force bases, so I was sort of in this place of being, on the one hand, in a space of incredible sort of nationalizing, where, you know, military bases. I was surrounded by mostly men in uniform all the time. There was a time of day when the national anthem would play and everybody would stop what they were doing. Didn't they walk in on the street, whatever, and, you know, put your hand on your heart. I always resisted that. That was, maybe that's part of my American character, I don't know, resisting saying the Pledge of Allegiance. But so I was in this place of incredible sort of indoctrination and acculturation, you know, in a military context. At the same time, I think many of us recognize quite early that our access to the rights and privileges of Americanness can be very constrained by who we are, right? So that, so yeah, I think I also, so it was both things at once, sort of noticing, particularly living on military bases in the Third World, for example, that the kind of deference to the U.S. presence, the kind of vying for attention, you know, when we would leave the base, these sorts of things, because we represented resources and money, right? But at the same time, I also recognized very early a kind of disdain for Americans, a disdain for them, a judging of Americans, and a real suspicion of Americans. Let me see, I just want to go quickly because I don't want to totally talk about myself the whole time, but because it's really not like me at all. So I just want to have show you guys another quotation. This is from Gloria Anzaldúa. Now, of course, with both of these quotations, there's much to talk about. Like they aren't simple and they are not without problems. So, for example, in the Martí quote, one of the things I might do with it in class is talk about gender. For example, the figuring of the Americas as a she. You know, and so with Anzaldúa here, I mean, it's not any less problematic in its own way, but here's what Gloria Anzaldúa in Borderlands La Frontera, which was published in 1987, I think. This is one of the things she says. She says, let's all stop importing Greek myths and the Western Cartesian split point of view and root ourselves in the mythological soil and soul of this content. Now, this is sort of another version of romantic primitivism, but still, like Martí, what she's trying to say is there are traditions that emerge from the Americas. And these are the traditions, the philosophies, the schools of thought, the practices, the ways of governing. These are what we need to attend to, is the native, the indigenous forms of governance, et cetera. And this is what Martí is saying, is we have to pay attention to what we already do well, because somebody's coming, and they're going to impose what they believe upon us. So we have to be strong. We have to be strong and you know, sort of rally around this knowledge that we've produced. And I think Gloria Anzaldúa wanted to say something similar. Now, I'm also thinking of, you know, and I was reminded of this listening to Professor Knupfer, talking about the Mayflower Compact, because, you know, when I was growing up, when I was in school, the narrative we got was from the East, you know, the Mayflower, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, then the Mayflower, but all of it very much focused on the eastern shore of the U.S. and then, of course, the westward expansion. But for many people in the U.S., many Americans, their histories come not from the East, but from the South, right, from the South. So very early on, what I noticed was that to be American meant to have an immigrant history, but a European immigrant history. Right? So there's this weird irony for Latinos, for example, or for Native people in the U.S., is that, like, my first semester here, when I went to teach my first class, a student raised her hand, and I said, yes, and she said, what nationality are you? And I was like, do I have an accent? Do I need to bring my passport? Like, why would someone ask me what nationality I was? What she meant was, you know, what's your cultural background, what's your ethnicity, et cetera, these sorts of things. But it is such an irony that for I think Latinos, like I said, for Native people, is the very fact that we look like indigenous peoples that makes it seem as if we're from somewhere else, right? So a kind of displacement, a real sort of radical displacement. So just to, you know, I'm just throwing up some more images here. This is like sort of, this is what I would say, this is another history of the U.S. and of the development of Americanness, which sort of begins in the South, you know, and my focus is on Mexico, the conquest of Mexico. Here we have, I just have for you some other images, Diego Rivera's representations of the conquest. This is another sort of imaging of America, imaging of a pre-conquest America. Now, some of these ideas about Americanness and, you know, primarily focused on Native people representing, you know, the savages, begins really early. So in, was it the 16th century? Montaigne wrote Rights of Cannibals. And one of the things he points out in that text is how Europeans commit barbarous acts that they consider to be civilized. He's really talking about a kind of cultural relativism. You know, we could look at these Native people in Brazil who practice cannibalism and consider that barbarous, but in that context, it's a way of honoring the dead. Whereas some of the things we do in Europe, you know, are barbarous in their own kinds of ways. So this was sort of the beginnings of this idea of the romantic or the noble savage. And some of this is incorporated to an extent in Rivera's representations of pre-conquest Mexico.
Where is that mural at?
Oh, this one might be in the education ministry. Oh my God. You're right. So anyway, let me hurry up real quickly. So so I guess what I would say about Americanness, and is there American character? You know, I don't really know, because I can't think of Americanness without thinking of Latin America. I can't think of American as being solely confined to the U.S. And so I would say, well, I imagine there are many American characters. But what American represents to me, I guess I would say, would be, you know, we could say American represents something indigenous, that the American character is indigenous, that which comes up from the continent. This is one thing I always say about Chicanos, about Mexican Americans. We became a people, we emerged as a people in the Americas. We're not foreign. We're not foreign to the soil, right? You could say, so the indigenous, you could say it's the entrepreneurial, you could say it's the frontier spirit. For me, and particularly with this history of, you know, traveling, which I did when I was quite young, I went to the Soviet Union. You know, I went to Moscow and Leningrad when I was like, before the breakup of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that really surprised us as these, you know, 15-year-old high school kids going there was how people didn't like us. And we thought that, you know, everybody everywhere else just, yeah, I know, I'm done. Just loved Americans, right? So we were really shocked by that, shocked by the disdain towards us. So I would say, and that really influenced me in how I perceived American and being American. I learned in high school that if you backpack through Europe, you put Canadian patches on your backpack. You know, you disguise being American. That being American is somehow shameful, is something, you know, in some cases to be ashamed of. The American character, I guess I would say, is acquisitive. You know, it's militaristic, it's predatory, it's excessive, it's arrogant. I mean, this to me is what American represents now at this moment, so particularly. So, sorry, it's even more depressing, perhaps, but,
Great, thank you. And it's interesting that we have on the table which America, because I think we've even heard from some of what's before us today that even within the borders of the United States of America, we could say which America. Just looking at different subcultures within the U.S. boundaries. And so the issue of is there American character, if we listen to the last presentation, is maybe. Maybe not. Maybe there are multiple American characters. And a couple of the themes that came across that struck me as potentially provocative that I'll throw out, and then we'll open it up for discussion and also see if our panelists want to jump in, is that part of being American, whether it's North American, Latin Americans, you know, Central America, is being obsessed with who we are and where we come from. You know, so this sense that we have to claim some stake to something. That markets and majorities, and one would argue minorities broadly defined, plays a role in that. I would challenge the idea of you're no better than I am if we look at the issue of who are some of our involuntary immigrants who aren't refugees. That one might say there was a period where people said, yes, I am better than you and I'm human and you're not. And so that plays into an American character. We also have the issue of economic self-sufficiency, and if you're not self-sufficient, then are you really worthy of anyone paying attention to you, and that role that it plays. And again, the issue of being more human than I am. The social construction, what does it mean to be acceptable? Is it acculturation? Is it that we somehow gloss over who we are to be acceptable, whether it's in sight or deed? And then this idea of what does it mean to be indigenous versus to come to this place, and is there something about the geography and the nature of this place and the people who chose to come voluntarily that also plays a role. So, you know, a lot on the table from our panelists, did an excellent job of bringing out multi-issues that really touch on whether or not there is an American character, singular or plural, and what does it mean to be an American. And so with that, I'm going to see if there's something briefly that one of the panelists wants to throw back out and then open it up to questions.
Yeah, I want to make sure that, you know, having done what I could to stick to my time limit, it's very easy for the suggestions that I've made to be caricatured. I want to make a couple of things evident here. First of all, in defining an American character, which to me means looking for commonalities, does not somehow sanitize the past of injustice. It doesn't remove from the past man's inhumanity to man, which Americans certainly have demonstrated their capacity to inflict upon others. My grandmother crossed the border in 1898. If we lived in a matriarchal society, my name would be Alvarez. It would not be Knupfer. She crossed the border from Mexico in 1898. I've still got her green card. And she immediately went to work. She was not required by the government to go to work. There was no policy concerning the border at that time, at least no official federal policy. She crossed the border, she went to work. She ended up teaching piano at a school in Chicago and married her piano teacher, who was German. She, in her own words, Americanized herself. She learned German, French, and English. I never heard her speak a word of Spanish to any of us in the family. She never brought us any of, at least in my family, the culture, the background that clearly she had, and it was clearly a rich part of her heritage. That was a decision that she made because she believed she needed to make it in order to survive in America. And she called herself an American and was very proud of that title. The reason that I suggest that we have these commonalities that I pointed out is that, to me, they suggest to us the way that Americans deal with change and with man's inhumanity to man. My only final suggestion here is think about not so much what people coming into the country would face in becoming citizens. Think instead about what newly made newborn or born citizens face in becoming American. The best example of this, and the largest example of this, was the emancipation of slaves. What did the freed people do as soon as their chains dropped off? They formed communities, they armed themselves, they elected their own officials, they engaged in all of the habits that we normally, that at least I listed here. In fact, I was inspired by their example to do so. That those initial efforts were snuffed out during Reconstruction does not remove from them the essential characteristics that they had that were not an attempt to live up to somebody else's stereotype of what it means to be an American. It is what newly freed slaves said they believed freedom is. That is how they defined it, and that is how they defined their citizenship. Now, to me, it is an indication of a commonality that exists in the American character. And that's why I raised those particular versions of the past.
Great, thank you. And we'll allow other panelists to weigh in. I want to make sure that we provide an opportunity for questions. So are there questions on the floor? And Joyce will come around with the microphone to ensure that everyone can hear your questions.
There we go. All right. I definitely enjoyed the panel and the contributions made by each of the faculty members here on the panel tonight. What immediately struck me during the first presentation, and it kind of carried throughout, was the idea that American character is constantly defined by contestation and about the politics of inclusion and exclusion, and that is the theme that kind of carried out throughout your narratives. On the last panel, on the last scholar's talk, she talked about the multiple types of America, and I kind of wanted to know how each of you kind of deal with inclusion and exclusion in your own work, and how you see it moving forward into defining an American character. There's all these incidents of violence that you pointed out. You know, it's one of the ways that we deal with other people that are happening throughout the country that are part of this historical legacy of kind of fine-tuning what it means to be American. So how do you deal with this in your work, and how do you see that being a part, those politics of inclusion and exclusion, defining the parameters for American character in the 21st century?
I just want to say something really quickly, and that is that, you know, from my perspective as a scholar who specializes in Mexican-American, Chicano, Latino literature, what I've just noticed is the state of Arizona, you know, Tucson Independent School District has banned a bunch of reading materials for Mexican-American studies curriculum, right? So if you're talking about inclusion and exclusion, I mean, what I'm seeing is at a time when I would have expected the histories of Mexican descent people to be more integrated into curriculum, you know, at the elementary and secondary level as well. What we're actually seeing is the opposite. For example, in Texas last year, the year before, the State Board of Education radically revised or edited textbooks, removing certain historical events from the curriculum. Cesar Chavez, I think, was taken out of the school book. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm seeing some very directed and specific exclusion of Mexicans and Latinos in particular.
Well, in some ways, in my own work as a writer and a filmmaker particularly, I know that issues of inclusion and exclusion and representation and wanting, I'm a very selfish filmmaker. I want to see me there. I know that those things drive me, you know. Those are part of what, there's a certain kind of privilege in kind of having the headspace to be able to write whatever you want to write. You know, there's a certain kind of privilege there. And I do get angry that I don't feel like I have that kind of privilege. Part of what drives me is, in terms of making films, and my daughter always accuses me of making films about black men. Like, you know, Dad, make a film about a black woman. I'm like, okay. But part of what drives me is, in some ways, wanting to be included, but also wanting to be included on my terms, wanting to set the record straight. You know, so all of those things in a jumble with, okay, what am I going to write about? Those things are informing me. Those things are guiding me. Those are the things that I want. So I want, in some ways, what has been expressed here is that I want all those things. I want them now. I want them how I want them. And I want to be included. And I want other folks to recognize that I'm included in that. So it's a pretty complex thing, I think.
You're an American character.
I am indeed, in a lot of ways. But I constantly feel like I'm pushing to be a part of that, to be included in that, you know? And sometimes, frankly, rejecting that or throwing it all up and saying, I want to reinvent it, you know? So I think it's a pretty complicated thing, but I know that that's part of what drives me as a filmmaker and a writer. You know, that's what I want to be out there.
Yeah. So, good question. I think my scholarly interests are largely with the institutions, the social institutions that help people either feel included or excluded. So sometimes those are, you know, state agents or agents acting on behest of the state. Sometimes they're community groups. You know, the ways, and my focus has always been, I guess, more, do you feel included locally? My experience, and I'm not claiming this is everyone's experience, but in my research, that's where I see people either feeling included or excluded, is more on this local level. And it might be because of the group of folks that I tend to study. So, you know, when John approached me about this, you know, is there an American character, I had to really think at a much broader scale than I normally do, because I think most of us are embedded in local communities. We are, you know, even when we're engaged with national and international kinds of things, we're always interacting with people in some kind of local space. And I don't mean that geographically, right? So we have activist networks that we might be involved in that cross the globe, right? But it's these folks that we work with that I think where we we go to these places where we feel included, and we are in conflict with the places where we feel excluded. I guess that's how I envision it in my work, if that makes sense.
Well, I've already said an awful lot already, but I see the public square as a very large place. And along the public square are institutions of both a public and a private nature. And that all of them involved in one way or another drawing citizens and, I don't know, non-citizens, people into civic life, into participation in civic life. In some cases, they are excluded, as women were excluded from the vote, but still were deeply active in temperance, prohibition, wages and hours legislation, and reform, for instance. There are many, many ways that people populate the public square. What made Jim Crow so insidious was that it reached into every institution that bordered the public square. Schools, churches, graveyards, streetcars, everything, from the way you encountered people on the street to the way you were buried, the hospitals you were born in, the blood that was put in your veins, everything. That's what made it even more insidious than other forms of discrimination. And my point is that the Americans have always argued about access to that square. Who can go there? Who can participate there? And I tend to see it as a place where people participate in many, many different ways. And as places where they exercise rights in very, very different ways. That reflects, I think, the tremendous diversity of the country of the United States. In my view, the United States created itself. It is a created, born nation. It has a birthday. And even though that birthday, as Frederick Douglass famously observed, was a birthday that African Americans could hardly celebrate while they were in chains. The fact of that birthday and the language that that birthday pronounced was the language of liberation. So from my perspective, the way to deal with inclusion and exclusion, at least in teaching and thinking about this for scholarship, is to think about a public square that is a very diverse place, populated with multitudes of institutions, public, private, and otherwise, where people engage in civic life.
Are there additional questions?
Let me challenge everybody, including the panel. I think that one thing that people assumed to a degree about what Peter raised was that all of those things were positives. And I don't think that you raised them as positives. The American characters, by its very nature, already conflicted the moment that you even begin to talk about it. You know, I think that, for example, you raised the issue of vigilantism, the issue of violence. You know, there's a lot to dislike in the American character. That is, it's not that we are holding ourselves to be Americans and are saying that that character is better than other characters, therefore. I think that a lot of this has been about trying to define what American character is with all of its various bad dark sides and light sides. So I think that it's interesting. I think what is true, though, and I think I want to get to Sheila's point, is that there are numerous things, maps of globalization that do a dotted line around the U.S., as if globalization is everything but the U.S., right? And in reality, if you want to talk about contestation, this border that we live within defines in and out. I think the question you raised about exclusivity and inclusiveness is very important, because by its very nature, anytime you define a border, anytime you define a character, anytime you define anything, you define in and out. Kurt Lewin, long ago, sociologist, talked about the notion of freezing and unfreezing. And I can't help but believe that a lot of this is about that every time we try to think that we've got it set, it's not unlike making a sandcastle where you're getting it done and the tide is washing out the bottom even as you're getting the turrets done. It's unraveling even as we knit it together. And I think that kind of operational metaphor might be an important one to think about in terms of what this conversation has been about. But any reactions to a lot of that rambling, I'd love to hear.
Well, I would just kind of briefly say that I just think it is all contested, and so you know, my first impulse when I think about the American character is honestly a positive one, but even for something that is like vigilantism, and you see, I don't even know how to talk about this now. I and my folks and my historical background would have a hard time relating to that as a commonality of the American character. I mean, I think my folks broadly would be dismissive of that and say, that is those folks that have done that to us. And so even in that negative, I just have a hard time claiming, not even just claiming that, but just even considering that. And so that's what I mean, that you know, it's a constantly being contested. So in your metaphor, you know, for me, like the sandcastle, I don't know if it gets halfway built before it comes in. So a lot of it is like, what time does that wave come in, you know? So just even something like that is difficult, you know? And the commonality thing is just very difficult. I understand that.
I guess I just wanted to also, just thinking too about a sort of history or a sort of American character of resistance or challenging authority. A part of the, in the sort of different iterations of primitivist thinking, you know, thinking about indigenous peoples, Native peoples have always been linked with resistance and with rebellion. Oh, sorry. And I don't know if I answered you, but that mural is in the Ministry of Education, I think. It was Vasconcelos who commissioned it. Oh, yeah, that one. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. So I think indigenous people have always been linked with resistance and rebellion. Why? Because their land historically has always been taken, and people have always fought that. So I think that sort of history of that character of rebellion or resistance too is something that you know that could be seen as coming from a sort of different quadrant of Americanness or something like that. And I think too, I guess part of my own resistance is that I see the idea of what is American now is having displaced other ideas about what American is, other sort of expressions of American character. And you know, in the end, I do believe that Americanness is represented as deeply concerned with egalitarianism, with access, with you know, a sort of leveling of hierarchies. You know, I grew up in a military environment, like I told y'all, and one of the things people say is in the military everybody's equal. You know, name, rank, serial number, everybody wears the same uniform. Well, you know, my experience of the military was that it was deeply segregated by class. You know, I never swam in an officer's pool, ever. You know, never was I invited to the O Club. You know, we were like an NCO family, which means, you know, my dad was enlisted, he didn't have a college education. So, you know, like I said, my perspective may be, you know, off-putting or seem excessive or, you know, but it's just honestly the way, you know, my thinking around these things has evolved, and you know, has a lot to do with having traveled a lot and feeling I have to compensate for my Americanness, or really try not to be that American, because we are really easy to spot, and it's not just because of the clothes we wear, it's because of the way we act, you know, quite frankly. So, and I you know, I'm not saying that's something that only other people do. I am implicated. I recognize it in myself, you know, most definitely.
What I ask my students to do is to treat everybody in the past as thinking individuals. At least grant them that respect. Start with the idea that as thinking individuals, they're responding to life's challenges just as any thinking individual would. I would understand why African Americans would view the idea of vigilantism as something that was inflicted upon them, as something that occurred to them. But I would not deny African Americans in the past the same humanity and the same flaws, the same problems, the same emotions, the same terrors, the same prejudices that are born of life itself. And I'm saying this because the history of slavery and the history of exclusion that is, well documented and is undeniable, is part and parcel of a very, very large and diverse history of peoples in the United States. It doesn't diminish the inhumanity of the institution to say so. It suggests that the people who populated it, all of them, were thinking individuals who were behaving in certain ways. It is very hard for me to get across to students in my class that slaveholders were thinking individuals. That a Calhoun could stand up in the Senate and say, I am a slaveholder and a Christian, and I am proud of it. And to explain why in his hubris, why in his arrogance, he would make such a statement, and why he would proclaim it as an American and say it. It is hard to convey that to students, because the past very easily becomes a place where heroes and villains exist, and they battle out and contest for control. And all I'm suggesting is that, in fact, it is a place populated by dead people that we can no longer talk to, that we have to try and resurrect their stories from the available record, and that in doing so, we have to start with the proposition that as humans, they were thinking individuals. To me, that helps us understand the notion of American character. And I think it also helps us understand the problem of inclusion and exclusion and of access, which I think is a big part of the conversation here today.
I would propose, to push this a little further, that it would be dangerous to go down a path to say that our contestation around inclusion, exclusion could narrow down. No one said this, I'm being a provocateur, could narrow down to the African American case or the Native American case, to make it such a base example. Those are real examples. However, we can come to 2012 and still find examples of where people are going to push on issues of classism, and people are going to push on issues of homophobia and issues tied to gender that all go with how do we define ourselves as American. So if we take any of those separate groups and come back to the collective and the commonality, how do we rationalize a melting pot, and what does that mean to be an American, and how do we define ourselves when we go abroad? And someone talks about that you are American, what does it mean to be an American? And we're going to make it border U.S. for a moment. So what does that mean, knowing that in 2012, the very same issues that we want to say were back in history and are dead are simply latent issues now, some barely under the surface, some right in our face, and we ignore them. So if we say that we're still working through this, what it means to be a melting pot, what does it mean to be an American? I want to throw that out to everybody in that sense.
In 1974, I had American Thought and Language here at Michigan State University. And in my class with Professor, just drawing a blank for a moment.
Can we ask you to use the microphone so we can...
Professor Babcock, he taught us many things about the American character by wearing museum quality hats and coming in. I'll never forget learning the word altruism. He asked our class to raise by show of hands what altruism is. None of us raised our hand. I believe today that defining the character building of the American is one that we are altruistic. I don't get away from Michigan very much. I did a study abroad to Mongolia and China, and people found our group from Lansing Community College to be altruistic. And they were delighted by that because when you actually met some Americans, you realize that we aren't all militaristic. It's huge. The other attribute coming from Michigan, the transportation state, the world's been changed by Michigan State University, the city of Detroit, because people have been privileged to travel. It didn't always exist. You had to walk. And it's remarkable being here in Michigan.
Can I just, so you say, you know, we're not all militaristic. Altruism is, you know, part of the American character. I mean, I think if you look at data overall, U.S. actually, from what I understand, has pretty high levels of donations per capita for various things. I mean, this is, you know, kind of part of what I think we have by you know, a huge amount, the largest military, you know, presence in the world.
I would say our government is very militaristic, but as individuals.
Well, right. So Sheila's telling these stories about, you know, going overseas and wearing Canadian stickers and, you know, that on you. So 2003, I was planning a trip to Argentina. At the time, I lived in Los Angeles. In this, I, you know, didn't have a ton of money. I wasn't living in the nice neighborhood, so I lived in this area where you could buy documents fairly easily. In fact, I would walk down this MacArthur Park, if anybody knows, big hangout for the heroin users, and pass there, and I would get asked, like, documents? I'm like, do I look like I need documents? I mean, I'm so white, right? But they would ask, so I thought, I'll go down there and get myself a Canadian passport. And then, you know, I'll be somewhere, I'll keep my U.S. passport to get in and out of the country, but I'll wave my Canadian passport around, and then no one will think I'm a jerk, like a typical American, right? This is my big plan. And couldn't find any Canadian documents, so I had to go with just my U.S. And what I found the first thing I did was I talked to a friend who taught Spanish, and I said, how do I say I'm an American without saying I'm an American? And she said, tell me if I'm right, but Los Estados Unidense.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Okay, so I said my husband, Los Estados Unidense, which basically I'm a U.S. citizen.
United States, yeah.
United States, yeah. So I tried, and my experience in Argentina was that people loved me when they found out I was an American, because they knew that if I was an American who traveled, I wasn't an American, right? So there is this American character that people conceive of, you know, this is what America is. A lot of it's our government. I had some great conversations with Argentinians because they had just recently had an election, and what was his name? The crazy guy whose wife was Vida.
Juan Perón.
Who had just won 20% of the votes after being, you know, just driving Argentina into the ground. And still people were voting for him. And so I said, well, you know, George W. Bush just won a re-election, and he's not, you know. So we had these conversations about our screwed up governments. We had these conversations about, you know, the character of our country and all the problematic nature of it. And we were two people who didn't share, you know, who were very comfortable generally in our countries with our nationalities, but not comfortable with many aspects of what it meant. And so I think, you know, I took the position that there is an American character of sorts. You know, I could be persuaded otherwise, but I think what's really important to remember is that not every American has that American character. That maybe a minority of Americans have an American character. when we say character, I don't know, we have to talk about what we're really talking about. Are we talking about, an historical foundation? Are we talking about mores that we, aspire to, even if we don't actually meet them? What exactly are we talking about? But I don't think we're talking about what are most Americans like. Because that probably is the thing I actually like the most when I watch the Olympics, right? You can always tell the nationality of all the other participants, but you can never tell who's the American, because we've got people from all over the world. Diversity. They have this diverse heritage, and they're skating and skiing and shooting baskets and arrows, all these for us. Well, there's an archery. There's an archery one with where they're skiing and shooting arrows. It's crazy. So, we have just, it's this incredible, multifaceted people. And I think we do want to separate that from, if there's a character or not, because, we might have an American character, but we are filled with characters in every sense of the word.
One of the things that I typically try to do is make sure that there's time if you want to engage with the panelists one-on-one. And so I'm going to thank the panelists and ask you to join me in thanking the panelists and also yourselves for participating in our conversation tonight, and invite you to come up and have an additional conversation with the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.